The Outsider podcast shares the opinions and analyses of Drew Landry. They are his thoughts, and his thoughts alone, and do not necessarily reflect every member of his audience or newsletter readers. Now, on with the show.
Hey, welcome in to another episode of the Outsider Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Drew Landry. And folks, it's so good to be with you. Thanks for joining in wherever you are, whenever you are, and however you are listening to the best politics podcast west of I-35 in the great state of Texas. I appreciate you being with me today. And in today's episode, we do the trot around the bases. And in today's main topic, it's more of the polling data when it coming to the Texas Senate race. So let's dive right in. Let's hit that ball and let's mosey on down to first base. And in our first stop in our trot around the bases, it has something to do with someone who was a big political voice out here in West Texas. Someone who I appeared on his show a few times when I ran back in 2018, and his name was Chad Hasty, and Chad Hasty unexpectedly passed away on Thursday, April 30th, sometime in the morning. And it was a pretty big shock. It was, shock to me, shock to some other political people throughout the state, the state representatives from Lubbock, the House Speaker, the state senator, and a lot of other people who are in the conservative movement out here, and other key political people who appeared on a show. It was a pretty shock deal. And so just 43 years old. And so I don't really know what the cause of death was. It's not really my business to know, but maybe if it's released out in the public, we'll get that info to you. So, I appeared on Chad's program when he was in the morning back in 2017, 2018, when I ran for state representative. And, he was a good interview. I mean, he really was. He was a bit tougher on me than he was on some others. But, the fact of the matter is this, he was of the conservative movement. I mean, he was a Republican. I mean, that's public information. But even whenever he interviewed other Republican leaders, he still asked some pretty tough questions. He asked some pretty decent things to say and added to the conversation. So while he and I may not have always agreed, we were respectful. Anytime I saw him, I walked up to him and shook his hand. I remember a time when it was after the election, and I thanked him for having me on his show. So I really appreciated it, appreciated his contribution to the political arena and his commentary out here when it came to politics and other aspects of sports and other aspects of culture, and so he'll be missed in that arena, and appreciate his contribution. And I'm always grateful for anyone who has me on their programs, and to have a good conversation about the issues of the day. So may he rest in peace, and to any of his listeners, it's a sad loss to his friends, and I'll keep all of them in my thoughts. So all the best to his family and his wife, and any of the other listeners that are out there who listen to him. That's first base. Let's round first. Let's head on into second base, where in the last week, the two big polling firms released some information on the Texas Senate race, the race for U.S. Senate that would represent Texas. And it has James Talarico, State Representative James Talarico, who's the Democratic nominee, in a pretty good spot. I mean, he's I guess what one person would say in the catbird seat. He is sitting sitting pretty right now. He doesn't have a majority of support, but he has more than the others. He's polling better than Cornyn, polling better than Kim Paxton, and so with that in mind, you'd think, okay, that's actually pretty good. Well, this is going to be the main topic that I'm going to get into a little bit later here. So, but I wanted just to introduce it to you that was one of the bigger conversations that happened in this week that I felt needed to have some attention. So I just spent just a little bit of time on that. That was a pretty big thing. I mean, the polling that was out there on him actually had him higher than what I actually thought was going to be, especially at this point when the Republicans are still trying to figure out who they're going to nominate. Interesting to say the least. That said, we round second on our way into third. Governor of Maine, Janet Mills, when she ran, she announced her candidacy for U.S. Senate to take on senior senator from Maine, Susan Collins. And it seemed like that was the right candidate to be there. She won Maine twice in a statewide race for governor, and it seemed like she would be the best candidate to take on Susan Collins. The problem with Janet Mills was that she had a really tough primary opponent in Graham Plattner, and Plattner had a lot of progressive people on his side, like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Whereas Governor Mills, it seemed like had the support of the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee, and Minority Leader Chuck Schumer was thinking that she was going to be the main person to carry on that particular campaign. Well, turns out that on Thursday, April 30th, in the morning there, that Governor Mills drops out of the race. And she cites the fact that she just couldn't raise enough money to really stage a good challenge to Plattner or stage a good challenge against Susan Mills. No, not Susan Mills. Susan Collins, excuse me. So that being the case, she dropped out. The phrase that they give now is suspending the campaign. And what that means is that they're going to keep fundraising to help pay some bills and whatever else. So that's what happened there. Her polling against Plattner was not good, and I think that may have been the main reason outside of fundraising. If you're not doing well in the polls, you're probably not going to fundraise all that much or do all that great with the cash. And it seemed like the momentum was going to Plattner, and that's where it ended up. All the best to Mills. I'm sure she's going to campaign for Plattner in this Senate race if she's asked to. I'm sure she'll do whatever that the Plattner campaign needs. But I know that she doesn't want Susan Collins to return as the senator from Maine, and it seems like if things keep going how they're going, that will probably take her. I'm so sorry. Let me get this all straightened out here. If things continue to keep going as they are, it seems as if Susan Collins will not be the next senator from Maine. She will lose her reelection bid. Now, let's round third. Let's head on home. And the big thing in this past week was really what I think was the biggest thing was the gas prices. Because of our involvement in Iran, because of the blockade taking place in the Strait of Hormuz, because of those being the biggest factors, gas prices, the price of oil has shot up. And this is turning out to be less of an economic problem, more of a political problem. And you're seeing here, there are some stories from the Texas Tribune where they actually talk to some people who say, it's looking like we're getting to $5 a gallon of gas, and whereas the president said $2, under $2, he's going to wave his magic wand and just give everyone $2 gas. Gas prices, oil and energy prices are a key indicator of inflation. And so if that's going to go up, that just means that more inflation is on the way. And so that also means that our farmers and our truckers are going to have to pay more for diesel and more for fertilizer. And so none of these things are going to be helpful to the economy. So what we're saying here is that what could have possibly have been $20 worth of gas like a week ago could possibly be maybe $40 to $50 worth of gas. And what you would buy a $20 worth of gas today may only get you maybe a couple of gallons, maybe 4 or 5 6 gallons of gas. So that's not, this isn't good. And what voters tend to do is blame it on the party in power. Now, again, whether that's fair or not, that's a whole other conversation. But those people know of one person who to blame, and it's usually the president, and it's usually the party in power. Is it always the president's fault? No, but it certainly can be. And when you can see a direct line from I'm paying more for gas due to the president's policy in Iran or some other policy, you can make that logical connection between the two. I mean, this is still going on. I mean, you're seeing other particular stories happening. Like there's one from the Christian Science Monitor saying how the average gas, whenever I'm recording this on April 30th, is about $4.30 a gallon. That's incredibly high. As the article goes on to read here from the Christian Science Monitor, that gas jumped by 72 cents a gallon in Michigan and 60 cents a gallon in Ohio. And those are going, and there's an interesting connection between those two. They have seats that are up for election in the U.S. Senate. So here you are seeing how gas prices are going up. The president's approval is down, and this is turning into more of a political problem for the president and Republicans than it is an economic problem in a non-election year. All right, that is the trot around the bases. Now, I want to get into next about the polling in the Texas Senate race. And in that Texas polling numbers, there's some pretty interesting findings. And they're really from two polls. All right, one is from the Texas Public Opinion Research. It's headed up by Luke Warford, who ran for a statewide office in 2022. And this is a more leaning on the Democratic side. This is more of a Democratic poll than really any other, like, academic or any other outside media survey. So you can already tell that this is really going to lean more to the Democratic nominee than to any of the Republicans. But that aside, the Texas Public Opinion Research released its findings on April 29th, just a few days ago. And here's one of the big things that it actually finds here, is that James Tallarico leads John Cornyn, sitting U.S. senator, senior senator from Texas, 44% to 41%. And he also leads Ken Paxton, 46% to 41%. And so there's a 3-point bump here, a 3-point difference between Tallarico and Cornyn, and a 5-point difference between Tallarico and Paxton. And so one of the big things that comes from the Tallarico find here is that a lot of his lead has to do with black voters, and a lot of it from Latino voters and also from college educated voters. They're the ones who are giving him this particular bump, and he leads Cornyn and Paxton in that in with black voters well over a majority. But that's also kind of a problem. There are about in the Tallarico versus Cornyn, there's 11% undecided, and in Tallarico versus Paxton, there's 9% undecided. So, with that said, you'd say, okay, well, this could go one way or the other here because of that 11%, later on to that 9%. Interestingly enough, okay, the moderate voters are actually going to break for Tallarico, and this is going on to the further breakdown from the TPOR survey, that Tallarico leads Cornyn among these people who identify as moderate by about 43 points, 16% to 19%. And that increases when it is dealt with Paxton. And he leads them almost by 50%. It's 65 to 16. Independents are breaking for Tallarico by more than 20 points. So the 17% who self-identify as a somewhat conservative argued that they would back Tallarico over Cornyn. And 19% of those who say that they're somewhat conservative would back Paxton. I'm sorry, would not back Paxton. Would back Tallarico over Paxton. So, interestingly enough, Cornyn and Paxton's biggest draw, and you can probably guess this, come from white, non-college educated rural voters. All right? And even at that, Cornyn and Paxton have a very low net favorability. They both underperform generic Republican candidates running for office. And they underperform under Abbott, under Trump, a Democratic candidate for governor, Gina Hinojosa, and also James Tallarico. So Cornyn and Paxton, according to this survey from the Texas Public Opinion Research, is pretty down just on their favorability. Whereas Tallarico's favorability is much higher than theirs. Interesting. So that's a pretty big takeaway here, is that Tallarico's favorability is higher than that of Cornyn and of Paxton. It's also, he is running higher than them. Now, the problem with this are the unsure voters, are those who are undecided. And you roughly have about 20% who are undecided in both the Paxton and the Cornyn surveys. Meaning if you combine that 11% with Cornyn and that 9% with Paxton, you get 20%. Okay. And look, that's a lot of room for Tallarico to grow here. But let's understand that this being a Democratic survey is also, that kind of bleeds in, that kind of brings in a sense of a bias. So you got to bake that into this particular poll. And I think with the Cornyn survey, with the Cornyn find, that's more of a tell. That's more of an interesting tell in that one, because that means that race would be much more closer than that of Paxton. I mean, if you were to just do this with, say that this race has a 5-point bias towards Tallarico. Say this particular survey is already +5 to Tallarico. Then the Paxton race, is essentially close. And the same thing goes for the Cornyn matchup. So both of these things are pretty close. Let's just be clear about that. The bigger thing we have to look at, though, is Tallarico's support among black voters, among black participants. And in this particular poll, it isn't that particularly great, Because if we go back to 2018, now TPOR wasn't around in 2018, but if we go back to 2018, Beto O'Rourke had maybe about a 40% run about 42, 43% with African American voters, with about 25, 30% or so undecided. That's a pretty big deal. Now, what O'Rourke was able to do between a April or June or finding here survey was able to close that gap, and he ends up winning the black vote by about 85%. With Colin Allred in 2024, he again was running had about the same numbers as O'Rourke. Had about 42, 43% of support among black voters, with a very high of black voters who are undecided. And by the time that election is over, he has about 84% victory set of support among black voters. Now say, okay, what's this have to do with Tallarico? Well, with the TPOR survey, there's about 16% who are among black voters who are undecided. And then there's about 6% in this race who are black voters who say they have no plans in voting in this race. All right. And that's with Cornyn, and that's even with Paxton. You still have about, roughly an average of 5% say that black voters say they're not going to vote in this race at all. So this is quite the big deal, because it seems as if that the undecided among black voters, it not being nearly as high as it is for Tallarico than it was for Allred and O'Rourke, it means one of two things. One is he has less room to grow, that they're coming on to his campaign, and that he doesn't need a lot of work to really do. That might be like, hey, they're really catching on here. He just has to get more of that to get to that, 83, 84%. If he can convince those undecideds to come out and vote for him, then that might propel him to a victory. Fair enough. Here's the other thing that it brings out. That he's already convinced them, and that's his ceiling. If a Democrat only gets, we're talking about statewide races here. If a Democrat can only get 65 to 70% of the African American vote in an election, that's bad news. That's real bad news. Because they're supposed to get anywhere between 84, 85 to about, 97% of the African American vote. And if a Democrat can't even get to 80, if he can't scratch 80% of the African American vote in a statewide race, then that's not good. That leads to a loss. Of course, let's understand that most of the African American voters in the Democratic primary between he and Jasmine Crockett voted for Crockett. I mean, you talk about someone who actually has the capabilities and the credentials to carry on that black voice. Of course it's her. But that doesn't mean that James Tallarico has to give up, nor can he take them for granted and just think that they're going to anyway. And that's been, I'm tapping into some online frustration that I read from some Democrats who are saying, Tallarico, he's not doing enough. He's not, he needs to represent more. He's got to do more, and they really want to rip him up, for a variety of reasons. Whether they think he's a liar or whatever. I'm not sure. I don't have any idea. But what I can say is this: is if those online, they want Tallarico to win. Like deep down inside, they actually want him to. And so they're being this sort of negative person because they want him to tap into this group and to, get into that O'Rourke and all red numbers, and hoping that this will encourage him, that this will push him, this will, want to make him to actually do this. Okay, I get that. They have a point, though. If that number of African American voters doesn't increase, if it stays in the mid 60s to the low 70s, and we're looking at a poll coming out in August, and these numbers haven't changed, Tallarico is in a lot more trouble than what people want to say. All right? Let's just make that very, very clear. He does have a very solid set of support among the Latino population. And that really propelled him to win the nomination back in March. And that is a growing population. And both parties want to tap into this growing power of the Hispanic vote. But one thing you have to remember is you have to also maintain your other set of pillars of support too while you do this. And if you lose a key part in that, that's not good. Let's look at the other major poll that was released not too long ago. It was released April 30th. I'm sorry. It was released April 28th. My bad. When we look at some polling here to deal with a variety of things, this comes from the Texas Politics Project, one of the top polls across the state. It has, it asks respondents several questions. And one of the first questions that any poll that's worth a lick is going to ask is, do you approve or do you disapprove of the job of the president? And currently, respondents in this Texas poll have a 45% approval rate of President Trump. We're talking about 50% disapprove. That is kind of where he's been really since last June. In June, his disapproval was 51. In August, it was 50. In October, it was 51. In December, it was 50. In February, it was in 49. And here in April, it's 50. So, he hasn't really had a giant disparity of those who approve and those who disapprove. It hasn't been a great double-digit runaway like you see in all of the averages. But still, the fact that Texas, that about half of Texans disapprove of the job he's doing is not good. Now, how does that seep into other races? Well, it just does. And so if we look at the race here for Texas Senate, and we'll use the Paxton case, because look, folks, you should know by now that I'm about 90% certain that Tallarico is going to face Kim Paxton. And I respect John Cornyn. I think he's done a fairly decent job representing Texas. But because of one vote that happened 3 years ago, for a very good reason, he's made some Republicans mad. And they've gotten loud enough to where now they have a pretty solid challenge against him. But the person they're bringing up is one of the most corrupt and scandal-ridden candidates they've ever had, and that's Kim Paxton. Paxton is, without question, a problem. Just like for anything. But that aside, Paxton is, I'm fairly convinced he's going to be the nominee for the Republicans. He's going to win that runoff. I would be pretty stunned if Cornyn pulls this out. Because I think Cornyn has hit his ceiling in that primary. I think him getting 43% of the vote was probably as high as it's going to get. And so Paxton has a lot of room to grow here, and I think he will. So I'm fairly convinced it's going to be Tallarico versus Paxton going into the fall campaign. And when we look at the sheer numbers of this, all right, just the sheer numbers. Again, this is from the Texas Politics Project. UT Texas Politics Project poll. 42% favor Tallarico, 34% favor Paxton. 5% wish it'd be somebody else. 19% say they don't have any thoughts. They're unsure. They're an undecided voter. Okay. Now we're dealing with this in April. I get it. That's a pretty high number of undecideds who can possibly sway this election. But let's look at a few things here. When we look at the independent, when we look at the party ID is what I meant to say here. 63% of Republicans say they're going to vote for Kim Paxton. 63%. In this hypothetical matchup between Paxton and Tallarico, 63% of Republicans say they're showing up to vote for him. 14% independents say so. 5% of Democrats. That's pretty funny. Although that's kind of how it goes anyway. Regardless, it doesn't matter what poll it is. The other party, you have a small number of support from the other party. 82% of Democrats are going to come out and vote for Tallarico. 39% of independents are going to show up for Tallarico. 11% of Republicans are going to show up for Tallarico. Again, 3% of Democrats wish it was somebody else. 8% of independents say wish it was somebody else. 6% of Republicans wish it was somebody else. The undecideds, 10% of Democrats are undecided. 20% of Republicans are undecided. And here's the biggest catch of it all. 38% of independents are undecided. Again, this is April. When we get to June and when we get to August and October, we'll have a clearer picture. Perhaps those undecideds and the independents will shrink. But interesting that it's almost the same number of people who are the same number of independent voters who are going to come out and vote for Tallarico. All right. When we look at those Republican numbers, we go back to the party ID here, that 11% of Republicans who are going to show up for Tallarico, almost a quarter of them lean to the Republican side. They lean to it. Think about that. Now, a couple of things that we have to look at here first is gender. All right, most men are supporting Paxton over Tallarico. More women are supporting Tallarico over Paxton. But when we look at the undecideds, 23% of them are women. They haven't made up their mind yet. Okay, neat. Let's look at the race. And it's kind of the same thing as we saw with the Texas public opinion research. 65% of those who are black are going to support James Tallarico. 17% of those who are black are undecided. 17%. Again, that's a very small number. When you compare that and contrast that with Allred last time and O'Rourke in 18, that number, folks, of undecideds is pretty low. So the question is, have they made up their minds? Is 65% the ceiling for Tallarico? And that's between Tallarico and Paxton Here's Tallarico and Cornyn. The numbers are a little different here. 40% comes out in favor of Tallarico. 33% come out in favor of Cornyn. 19% are undecided. Again, same number of undecideds as that in Paxton, but just a little bit less of support for Cornyn than there is for Paxton. But Tallarico's numbers go up just a little bit when he faces Paxton than when he does under Cornyn. And you typically have the same number of people here. I mean, when you look at the party ID between Paxton and Cornyn, Cornyn has 60% of Republicans coming out for him. Paxton has 63% of Republicans coming out for him. Cornyn has 60. Paxton has 63. All right. It's really the same amount of things here. But let's look at gender, and let's look at race between these two. Cornyn gets more men vote, gets more of the male vote than the female vote. All right. And he gets more male voters than Tallarico. Tallarico gets more female voters than male voters, and he gets more female voters than Cornyn. But again, the leading gender in this is women when it comes to those who are undecided. The undecided is about 22% women. They haven't made up their minds as to what they want to do here. But when we look at race here, again, it's about what it was with the Texas public opinion research. 60% of those who are black voters are going to support, or at least who are surveyed here, will support James Tallarico. 18% of black voters who are surveyed here said that they are undecided. And you can say, well, what all does that really mean? Let's remember what all that this can really be about. It can be one thing, hey, he doesn't really have to work that hard as the others did. There may not be a whole lot of room for him to really grow, which is the downside. Maybe he has reached his peak here. And again, we have to remember, any Democrat who can't get 84, 85, 86% of the African American vote in a statewide race isn't doing very good. Is probably not going to win. Okay? So that's what we have to really bear in mind here. And you would think that, okay, well, that let's look at the location. The location here, but between the Paxton support and the Cornyn support, where Cornyn is going to get a lot of his support from the rural areas. The rural is really the one leading the most with 37%. The 34% comes from the suburbs. Here's something else that's kind of interesting here. Tallarico gets almost 30% of the rural voters, and 22% of rural voters are undecided. And that's with John Cornyn. With Paxton, Paxton gets 44% of the rural voters. Nothing really changes here with Tallarico. He gets 28% of the rural voters, whereas 22% again are still undecided. So the rural vote here is going to come into play yet again. Tallarico is going to run away with the urban vote, whether he faces Cornyn or Paxton. That's just going to be there. He's going to get more of the suburban vote than Paxton and Cornyn will. That's just going to be there too. So it looks like that what will offset this could possibly be rural voters. And, here's another big thing here. If we look at age groups, the 30 to, the middle age groups, 30 to 44, 45 to 64, they're coming out in favor of Tallarico, especially when it comes to the polling between him and Cornyn and him and Paxton. which is kind of amazing that age group is excited to actually vote for this and to break for the Democrat. Of course, the older crowd, which makes up most of our voters, 51% are going to come out for Paxton. 47% of them will come out for Cornyn. But what I'm often thrown out here is, well, what about the younger voters? What about the 18 to 29? Okay, 38% say they'll come out for Tallarico if he faces Cornyn. 36% say they'll come out for Tallarico if he faces Paxton. I mean, yeah, okay. But let's understand the younger vote is not a reliable source. It never has been. I mean, just ask George McGovern how that worked out for him in 72. It just didn't. So I don't think relying on the youth vote here is really going to be helpful, but relying on that middle-age vote, that is going to be helpful. This is a pretty big, these are some pretty significant numbers here for Tallarico in both of those surveys when it comes to the age group, when it comes to gender, when it comes to location, even party identification. It's pretty interesting. But we have to be very mindful of Tallarico's source of support with black voters. I mean, if he wants to win this thing, he's got to get that. He's got to truly improve on that. He has to. He legit has to. And look, I've also said this, that if character is what you're talking about here, you really have to ask yourself, who are you going to really come out for? And this is where a group that would think that character matters most is with those who think that religion is a big deal. And with that, when Tallarico faces John Cornyn in this potential matchup, those who think that their religion is extremely important, Cornyn gets 42% to Tallarico's 30%. When we look at the same group with Paxton and Tallarico, Paxton gets 43%, Tallarico gets 33%. If it's somewhat important, we go back to Cornyn and Tallarico. Tallarico gets 41%, Cornyn gets 31%. To those who say it's somewhat important. We look at the same group, but with Paxton and Tallarico. Somewhat important. Tallarico gets 41%, Paxton gets 34%. And when you break down these numbers here, there's more bad signs for the Republicans than there are for Tallarico. But the most glaring bad sign for the Tallarico campaign is his support among African American voters. Because if that number doesn't improve in the next 3 months, in the next 4 months, in the next 5 months, you see how this works? That is going to be where he will absolutely crater. All right. But that's the good news, is that he's got plenty of time to improve on that. And people online, and let's understand here that people online don't always have a great deal of patience. They want it, and they want it now. But what we have to remember is that real life is not social media. Tallarico knows that. I think to a point, John Cornyn knows that. Maybe Kim Paxton knows that too. But let's also remember here that your loudest critics, no matter whether it's a small megaphone or a large megaphone, however you view the importance of social media in campaigns, that's where your loudest critics will be. And the loudest critics right now are on the Democratic side, and they're pretty upset with how Tallarico is running his campaign. They want more involvement from the African Americans. They want him to go and talk to them. They want them to be there. Wants more action there. I think for some, if he does that, that would change some people's minds. But there are those who, he could spend 6 weeks there. He can go to the third ward of Houston, and go to some other portions of Dallas, and he could spend 2 to 3 weeks there, and they still won't be happy about it. No, well, he did it wrong, or it's always that stuff. Okay, while these races are important in and of themselves on the ballot, and this Senate race is going to be top of the ticket. It's top of the ticket stuff. Here's what everyone's going to have to really remember, is that approval rating of the president. People don't really want to talk about that so much, and I don't really know why. They think that the president and his approval rating is going to be out of sight, out of mind, when it's not. It is going to be very much in mind, and if the economy stays the way that it is, he's not going to have a very good night. It was just released on the day that I'm recording this that a Republican majority PAC, a political action committee, is already sending out memos saying, hey, man, we don't know if we're going to keep our majority in the Senate. With gas prices high in Michigan and in Ohio, and those seats being up for re-election, with a popular candidate in North Carolina, with Graham Plattner, who's very popular in Maine among Democrats, and Susan Collins possibly being gone, with the Democrat in Alaska possibly doing that, possibly winning there, former Congresswoman who's won a statewide race before. All those things are just really into the mind of these PAC leaders who are very concerned that the Republicans are going to lose Congress, not just the House. I mean, the House, we can do this gerrymandering stuff all day long. I mentioned about that in the last last week's episode. Florida has redrawn their maps. The Supreme Court has said it's a higher standard for racial gerrymandering. Racial gerrymandering is still unconstitutional, but what happened in Louisiana, where they actually created a majority-minority district, they said no, you can't do that. That's too much of racial gerrymandering, unconstitutional. When in reality, it was, the whole court system was up in arms and didn't really know how to rule on it. One lower court said it's fine. Another lower court said it wasn't. Goodness gracious. And now you have Governor of Louisiana, Jeff Landry, who I'm not related to, and I'm glad I'm not related to that guy, has already suspended the primaries. He has suspended the primaries until Louisiana's state legislature redraws maps, adopts a new set of maps. I think that is worth suing somebody in Louisiana's state court or federal court or wherever. Need to do that pretty soon. I got off on that small tangent about the whole gerrymandering thing that's happening. I really don't think that's going to matter much. I really don't. Even if New York wants to add 3, 4, 5 more Democratic seats, if Illinois wants to add 4 or 5 more Democratic seats, go for it. Washington wants to add a couple more Democratic seats. Oregon, go for it. Colorado, New Mexico, so be it. And I just have to ask, how much of that is going to be offset by other Republican states gerrymandering? This is the thing. It comes right back to the whole conversation about front loading when states deal with their primaries. If all of the states front load, if all of them have their primary on between January and March, you have 50 some primaries, then what's the point of front loading? It's going to be the same strategy as it is for presidential elections. In the general, you go to the states that have the most delegates. If every state is gerrymandering and just a handful say, no, we're not going to gerrymander, what difference does it really make? Not much. Not much at all. So that's why I'm thinking here, maybe 22 seats are going to be up for re-election that are going to be truly competitive. 16 seats may actually be up for grabs. 13, 14 seats. And when those polls are done, the Democrats are in better shape with that. And that comes straight from the Cook Political Report. The nonpartisan, highly expert analysis from Amy Walter and so many others have highlighted the fact that it may not really matter all that much. Republicans they're going to lose the House. And the fear is they're going to lose the Senate. I don't know if I said this to you yet, but I want you to bear this in mind. The election is less than 6 months away. Okay, that's a lifetime in politics, folks. It's a lifetime. But if Democrats win in Alaska, if Democrats win, well, let's do this through the time period, through time zones. The Democrats are going to hold on to New Hampshire. I'm fairly convinced. Probably going to flip Maine, and we'll flip North Carolina. If the Democrats flip Ohio, and if the Democrats flip Iowa, Texas is going to flip. That's a high chance of that happening. Okay. I don't really know when Iowa's polls close, but if Ohio goes to Sherrod Brown and Iowa goes to the Democratic nominee, who I can't think of off the top of my head, and if the Democratic candidate for governor in Iowa wins that too, Texas is going to go. Texas is going to elect its first Democratic candidate since 1988. That's going to be the trend. It won't be so much about how much those candidates are loved as it is how much the president is unliked and Republicans are feeling punished for it. I am of the mind that 2026 is going to be kind of like 2018. You're going to see anger come out in these polls. You're going to see anger come out in these elections. Now, that's me saying this in late April, early May. Anything can change. We know this. Time is not set in stone. Time is fluid. Anything can happen. Public opinion is down now. It may go up. And with the president's numbers, there's only one place where it can go. It can only go up. So yeah, that can happen. But if things don't improve, and we're looking at where we are now in late August, it's over. That election is done before it even started. Okay. All right. That's good enough here. Appreciate y'all listening. All right. And thank you for joining me and in this episode. All right. And I will see you again very, very soon. Thank you.
The preceding analyses and opinions were that of Drew Landry and his alone. They did not necessarily reflect all of his podcast listeners or newsletter readers. Thank you for listening to the Outsider Podcast. Be sure to follow The Outsider on X and on Facebook. Also, don't forget to sign up to be a free subscriber to his newsletter on Substack. Just look for The Outsider. We will see you again next time.